Thank you so much for joining. My name is Alexandra Hamilton. I am the founder of Youth in Politics. So, we are a youth led organization dedicated to promoting advocacy and awareness about government and things in general. And we wanted to draw upon your experience and a little bit about what you do. So, our first question was, you are the first African American to be appointed as United States Magistrate Judge. Can you explain to us how you secured the position and the impacts of it on the community?
Probably that that is a long journey, but I ended up coming to Howard University in 1952. Little country boy from the rural area, Spotsylvania County, Virginia. But I had a drive to excel, and in my first semester, I made all A's, except in one grade dealing with swimming, because prior to that time in life at 17, I'd only been in the Negro Beach 2 or 3 times in my whole life on the inner tube. So I got a D in that course, which was a 1 hour course, and an A in everything else. And then I did well in straight A's in the first semester, got to my sophomore year. Eventually, Brown versus Board of Education came down, and I only had 2 grades on my transcript in May of 54 that weren't A's, and I had come to the attention of the Vice President, James Nabrit, who was also one of the senior lawyers for the NAACP, and to Mordecai Johnson. And because of my academic record so forth, almost straight A's, I was called by Nabrit after that decision came down, and the sophomore year, and was introduced to Thurgood Marshall. But I said I didn't have to be introduced to him, because when I went to later on at NYU Law School, I had occasion to meet him again, but I'll tell you about that later. But that was my first encounter with Thurgood. And at that point, after Brown came down in October of 54, they called me to Nabrit's office and said, "Arthur, you had the most brilliant record of any colored or Negro youth. We want you to become, since you're from Virginia, to become the lead plaintiff in Brown versus Board of Education to compel Virginia to abandon massive resistance to complying with the Supreme Court decision." This is October 54. And I said, let me discuss it with my parents. I went home in November of 54 and told my parents that they wanted me to become involved in this case, but it couldn't mean that the Klan would burn the house down. Mom, you could be raped, Daddy, you could be killed. And they say, we knew God gave you a talent and a drive. We will back you up. My mother started praying the 23rd Psalm, that yea, you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you should fear no evil. And I went back and told Nabrit and Thurgood that my parents had approved and would run the risk. And they said that once your name becomes public, this is October, November of 54, they would give me 2 deputy U.S. Marshals to live with me 24 hours a day to keep the Klan from getting to me. And I lived under that threat from October, November, until April. In April of 59, Orville Forbes in Arkansas was making noises about closing all the colored schools in Arkansas. And Nabrit and Marshall decided to try to settle with Virginia my case, a potential case. And of course, they also asked me as backup to University of Virginia Law School to apply to the top white schools in the country, Columbia, NYU, Syracuse, and Boston, that would admit you after your junior year in college, what they call combination. Harvard didn't have that at the time. So I applied to all four of those law schools, and they worked out a settlement with Virginia where Virginia agreed to pay all my expenses to send me to law school up north. I was going to go to Columbia, but then NYU, which was my second choice, offered me a full faculty scholarship in addition to, and made me a teaching assistant to Emma Zola Berman. If I came to NYU, Emma Zola Berman was considered at that time the leading medical malpractice lawyer in America. And I decided to go to NYU instead of Columbia because I had a younger sister 5 years younger and a brother 7 years younger. And I said, if I went to NYU, I would be going to NYU with the equivalent of two packages, one by the law school and one by Virginia. They could save all that money for my younger brother and sister, who eventually both got double degrees. And I went through law school with no expense to my parents. When I got to law school, I was shocked. I was the only Negro of color person in my class. And indeed, it wasn't until I graduated that I learned that there was one other Black, a Negro person, in the evening division. Of almost 300 students, there were only two Negroes who graduated in 1958. In my third year law school, apparently Thurgood Marshall had learned of me from neighboring and asked me to come for an interview with him. And I went to his office in New York, submitted to an interview and said that he wanted me to become his civil rights lawyer assistant upon graduation from law school to handle civil rights cases all over the country. I said, it's a great offer. I wish I were twins, because I just also applied to the Justice Department in 1955 and was one of the 50 or 60 people they recruited for the honors program, but the only person of color. And that's after much agony and about an hour and a half conversation, I turned Thurgood down and said, I want to go inside of the Justice Department and make sure the federal government is racially blind, that the Lady of Justice is really blind, and the justice is administered with equal hands to all category of people, regardless of race. And I turned them down at that point. This was at my third year law school and went to the Justice Department. The Justice Department, I think I was the fourth Black lawyer that they had ever hired in 1955. I'd gone to law school with the idea of going into military service, and I still was subject to the draft. So I applied for an Army commission because I could not qualify for the Air Force because I have eyesight problems and vision and so forth. But eventually, when I did go to Justice Department, my local draft board would not hold up, and I got drafted into the Army in November of '58. Even though I was an admitted lawyer to the bar, the military told them I was under active consideration. Their prime candidates, they would not hold up. And so eventually in September of that year, I matriculated at NYU Law School with Professor Edgar Kahn being my guidance counselor at NYU Law School. And almost every other time a student was called on by a professor, I was that student as if they were trying to embarrass me. But I had the answer. I had what the Supreme Court had said in my mind like it was embedded there. And there were only three women at that point, also white women. I think two of them were Jewish, one might have been Christian. And I think I got 50% of the call on, even by the professors at NYU Law School in '56 and '57. But I always read they treat me like I'd come here from outer space. And then, like I said, I ended up in the Justice Department. I got drafted into the Army, made an acting sergeant the second day I reported for duty, and actually performed the duties of a sergeant, even though I was a private E1, a draftee. Then I got shipped to California, where I was made the chief specialist administrative clerk to the sergeant major and to the colonel, who was the head of a brigade of 5 battle groups, about 25 companies. But I so excelled there that I made history also. I was a specialist 4 when an airplane carrying the commanding officer and deputy commanding general of Fort Ord, California were killed in a plane crash. The commanding officer of the brigade, in which I was the administrative assistant to the sergeant major and to him, appointed me as acting colonel, basically, to oversee the operations of a military operation at Fort Ord, California. And I did such an outstanding job in doing so that the Secretary of Army, Wilbur Brooker, gave me the Army Commendation Medal. And they wanted me to stay in the military. And I said, I didn't want to stay in the military for 10 or 11 years to put the time in to get to be a colonel of the work I'm doing now. So no, I'm going back to the Justice Department. I go in and I was commissioned in the Army Reserves as a first lieutenant. And I stayed in the Army Reserves until for about 9 or 10 years. And then my children were getting to be teenagers, getting ready for college. And I resigned my Army commission after 9 years, or in 1960, when I was appointed to U.S. magistrate judge is when I resigned that and said I didn't want it to be away back in the military, called active duty in a situation much like we have today with Ukraine or so forth. I resigned my commission, even though I had qualified education-wise for appointment to be a major or colonel. So that was my military career and my educational career. And I'll answer any other questions you might have. I might want to emphasize that I had my encounters with the police as well. At 17 years of age, I took my first job following graduation from high school. Got a job at Howard Johnson Restaurant as the busboy. But I was so active and energetic and thorough that the managers of the hotel and restaurant or the restaurant operation made me almost their night manager. And in July of 1952, they left me there to clean up and lock up the place when my father's second vehicle was in the shop. And I was on the back stoop waiting for him to come pick me up at around 11:10, 11:15 p.m. Unfortunately, a police car pulled up, headlights on me about 8 or 10 feet away from the back stoop. Officers jumped out with guns drawn, white officers, of course. At that point, they didn't have Negro. And they said, boy, what are you drawing? You a burglar here? I said, no, I'm the busboy. They said, oh, yeah, my father drove up. They made him stay in his car back there, and they didn't accept my story or his. They factually arrested me, locked me in the car. Fortunately, they took me to Mr. Overton's home, Mr. Nugent. Mr. Nugent was the second in command. He vouched for me, but had I made a quick move like I was reaching for a weapon, I might not be here to be interviewed today by you. And I did, and I told the FBI all this when I was investigating for employment with the Justice Department. But had I made a quick motion, or they had said I had a weapon or something in my hand, I may have been a pre-civil rights victim, much like the cases you read about today. I was, second time was at Washington, D.C., and they had a procedure called arrest for investigation. I pledged to Omega Psi Phi fraternity, and they had us on a scavenger hunt one night when a fellow pledgee's father, who was a mechanic, had lent him a car from the shop he worked in. 9, 10 o'clock at night, we going up and down the alley looking for broken bottles are basically trash. Come back, a police officer sitting in the car and say, "What are you guys up to?" We say we're college students from Howard, we play each other, and we are just looking for broken bottles or bricks or whatever junk they had asked us to find. He didn't believe us. He took us into the police precinct, locked us in a room around 11 o'clock at night. At 5 a.m. in the morning, they knocked on the door and said police have canvassed the area to make sure there were no break-ins or any crimes and that the car was legitimate. You guys better keep and they used the negative word ASS on House campus from now on. But actually, I was detained in a locked precinct room along with my 3 companions, pledgees, for about 5 to 6 hours. Those were my 2 encounters with the police growing up and going to college and my background and experience. And the rest is history. I ended up going to the Justice Department, ended up excelling, ended up becoming to Bobby Kennedy when he came in on January 21, the day after Jack Kennedy was sworn as president. And I think the first day or second day he was there, he asked about what Negro lawyers do you have there? And they told him about me, and he called for me and said, "Arthur, you're the most brilliant Negro I've ever met. I want you to be my special assistant to monitor the Martin Luther King movement, to make sure the police and law enforcement agencies, the FBI, do not engage in any unlawful practices, or that the Communist Party would not infiltrate it." Say, but don't tell the other white lawyers, especially the senior ones, that you have that function. Just tell them you're my special assistant, let them think you're my butler or my personal assistant, my brother. I said, fine with me, because I don't want the publicity and I don't want the harassment. And I ended up serving then from 1961 until Bobby left in 1965 as his confidential assistant and monitoring the Martin Luther King movement, monitoring the organized crime movement, the Jimmy Hoffa operations, and again, even with the section chiefs of various sections of Justice Department and organized crime, he represented to him. I was his personal assistant. So they wouldn't inadvertently mention that I was an honest attorney working for him to monitor the Martin Luther King movement. And when Martin came to Washington and made his I Have a Dream speech, I was the undercover agent on the mall pretending to be a tag-along, but with direct access to Bobby Kennedy and to Jack Kennedy as president, should we needed to call out the National Guard or the military. And I did that duty, and then later, or of course, Jack Kennedy gets assassinated. And or got assassinated before then. And Bobby learned about it. The first person he called for me was for me when he got into the Justice Department that day around 1 o'clock. And he said, "Arthur, I'm too emotional today. I want you with me here all day today. Raise your right hand." And he swore me in to be acting Attorney General of the United States to handle the phone calls and the messages from the Justice Department to the U.S. Attorney and the FBI and Jack Ruby Oswald fiasco. And from shortly after 12 or 1 o'clock until 1, 2 o'clock that morning, I was in Bobby Kennedy's, sitting in his office like his personal attendant, but acting in his role with him as a backup to program me like I was a puppet to what to do and how to handle the assassination of his brother. All of this has been documented by consultants, and even the Library of Congress has in fact prepared and published a book on me, about 235 pages on my legal history and professional experience, and all of this has been corroborated. And then when Bobby left to run for the Senate, I transferred to the U.S. Attorney's Office. as a senior prosecutor. Further along the way after that, Walter Washington was mayor of Washington, D.C. He got to know my reputation and background. And when uh, he was mayor and we had the riots in Washington, D.C., uh, so I was approached to become the legal counsel to the police department, what they now call general counsel. Again, I was the first person there to make sure the police did not engage in any civil rights violations or retaliations against Negro rioters and Negro communities in Washington, D.C. I was there only for what, 8 or 9 months before I was approached and asked to apply for the U.S. magistrate position, now called magistrate judges, and became the first African American United States magistrate judge. They called magistrate at that point, in June of 1969, and became the liaison to the Federal Judicial Center and to Justice Tom Clark, who had retired from the Supreme Court, and became the leader there in judicial education, not only for magistrates, but for federal court judges in the Constitution, the search and seizure, preliminary hearings, arrest warrant procedures. And I took the lead role in bringing the magistrate system up from the commissioner system to a misdemeanor court judge role. And I'll pause there for your further follow-up question, but I ended up spending 6 months or 6 years there, but the salary was only 75% of what federal district judges got. And in 1975, 6 years or so after I'd been on the job, I again was contacted and say, would you be interested in becoming the chief counsel, legal advisor for the federal civil service system, to revise the federal civil service system? I said, only on one condition, that my opinions would be treated like that was a district court judge. And it was what, $25,000 jump in salary too. So with the kids going off to college and stuff, I said I would take the risk and lead the magistrate position, they call magistrate position, and go to the Civil Service Commission with the understanding that I would not be political, but I would act like a federal district court judge would act on any federal civil service matter. And then I was in the Civil Service Commission where I became a personal aide. President of the United States and advisor from the civil service system. And I'm the lawyer that wrote the Civil Service Reform Act of 1965, of that period, 1969 rather, and treated like I was a U.S. District Court judge. And indeed, when the Civil Service Reform Act was passed, I was president stand-in and lead witness for the administration in passing the Civil Service Reform Act and creating the Office of Personnel Management, the Merit Systems Protection Board, the Federal Labor Relations Authority. And I was the lawyer that approved all reorganization of the federal government to take education out of HEW, to create the Energy Department, to create the Inspector General system, of making sure that the federal government operated in a constitutional manner. And then along the way, after being at the commission, the guy who took my place as magistrate judge got appointed to the Superior Court. Superior Court judges' salary then had been raised, and I applied and went back to becoming the magistrate judge a second time. And the second time, with the reorganization and activities of magistrates and changing that title, they had permitted magistrate judges to try civil cases with consent of the parties acting as substitute district court judges. So I went back as a magistrate again in 75, and then at that point in the Carter administration, where I was administrative spokesman before a committee that passed the civil service work 14 straight hours, not only to get administration, but I was at the table to rebut any criticism until almost 7 o'clock that night from being the first witness that morning. I'll pause now for any further questions further down the road that you might mention, but I might mention in 1985, I was back on the court there as a Superior Court, as a Superior Court judge, as a U.S. magistrate, where in 1985, I tried 13 civil cases as United States magistrate acting as a federal district court judge. I applied for a seat there to be elevated to a U.S. district court judge, but a guy named Ed Meese was Attorney General, Public Administration, and a guy named Ross Lambert, white guy, very friendly, very close colleague of mine, very open-minded, had also applied, and I'm told by him personally that Ed Meese said I was more qualified than he was, but there are enough black judges on the U.S. District Court now. And Lambert got appointed to the federal court appointment, later became chief judge of the court, and so forth. I was appointed to the Superior Court by Ronald Reagan in '87 until I retired. And when I retired as the senior judge with authority to continue to marry people and do some common law part and be subject to recall for acting as a master for the court system for the rest of my life. So that's my judicial background.
Could you please tell us how you have impacted global youth justice
Well,
and what's your role in it?
Okay, well, let me back up for a second. As a result of a magistrate position and under Janet Reno when she was Attorney General, she was interested in how the system would function. And I was the liaison to Janet Reno. Matter of fact, she served on a committee in which I was the chairperson and she was a member of the committee. And I got to know Scott Peterson, who then was in Justice Department and grants to youth. And she asked me to be an advisor to Shea Bilczek, who was the kind of associate attorney general for youth matters and so forth. And as a result, I developed a relationship with Scott Peterson of being his advisor, so that when he created the Global Youth Justice as a corporation, and I had reached the point of retirement or potential retirement, he asked me to be vice president, and I've been working with him then since, I guess, the late 1990 or around early 90s. But I was an advisor to Shea Bilczek, who was Janet Reno's leader of the OJJDP, and so that's how that came about. And then as a result of that role, I became an advisor to the top officials in the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. So that's how that relationship developed. And as a result of being connected with Janet Reno and the people doing the era of that administration, I worked very closely as a consultant or advisor to that office. And out of that office, I developed a relationship with Scott Peterson, where when he left, as a result of the so-called Republican favoritism of certain people by way of getting grants, so he asked me to be his advisor and help him set up and establish what was later incorporated as Global Youth Justice. So I've been affiliated with Scott from the time he was blew the whistle on certain people being grantees of substantial grants for political favoritism and so forth.
That sounds great. So therefore, what challenges did you face as you served in your legal career? Was it difficult for you to gain some legitimacy? And how did you go about networking and expanding the work you did?
Well, In the course of doing all of these research projects and work, especially even as a magistrate, I had high school students, high school students as well as college and law school students serve as interns to me, and especially in habeas corpus and post-conviction prison attacks and civil rights type issues with reference to how the criminal justice system had worked and was working. And based on that, I led the American Bar Association effort to put a special focus on youth justice matters, and the combination of the ABA as well as the Justice Department led me to become one of the senior legal advisors on how properly to handle juvenile justice issues and make sure the Constitution is complied with and civil rights are protected in that system. So there were many times, even as a magistrate, after work during that day, Joe Biercheck's office, who was an assistant to Daddy Reno's office, was only a block or so from the courthouse. He would ask me to come over and just sit and consult with him on certain matters for 2 or 3 hours at the end of the day, and I'm getting home for dinner at 8 and 9 o'clock at night. That's the relationship I had with him, and even I have with him now, where he heads a program dealing with conferences and education in juvenile justice and youth matters. And I've been a frequent commentator, a panelist in programs he put on with a major law school here in Washington, D.C.
Thank you so much. We have one more question for you. Can you tell us about what you consider to be your greatest accomplishment as a judge?
Well, I think my greatest accomplishment as a judge would be the reform of the civil service system and favoritism. And that, remember that when Roosevelt was president, there was a question of the federal government even hiring Negroes other than people to mop up the floors and clean up and be janitorial type work. And Truman was the one who opened the doors wide and so forth, and opened the doors to professional blacks. My understanding and what I was told, that when I joined Justice Department as the fourth black lawyer, there were 3 Negro lawyers. One was Bill House, who had been Jacob Hoover's chauffeur. Other was Maceo Hubbard, who had been a mailroom clerk. And the other was Julia Cooper Mack, who was a black woman, and she had just been a secretary until she was reclassified as a lawyer about a year or 2 before that. I was the fourth black lawyer in the Department of Justice in 1958 when I joined it, before I got pulled into the service for 2 years in the draft system. So like I said, I went through that whole history and so forth, and was trying to be subdued and not seeking any glory or prestige, and not even knowing what my role was, to keep my mouth shut as much as I could. But at the same time, pushing the idea of total equality in whether you're dealing with blacks. I don't think even at that point there was as much emphasis on Hispanics, but also dealing with Muslims and religious minorities in the country at that point.
Thank you so much for your insight. Do you have any final thoughts for youth watching this who want to get involved with the legal career or anything related to that?
Absolutely. Matter of fact, right now, I serve as a consultant or advisor to a gentleman named Joseph Biden. And indeed I had the honor that in preparation for his State of the Union message, I wrote 2 paragraphs dealing with police community relations and also dealing with the issue of equality and treatment of people based on their intellectual capacity. Martin talks about character. I talk about their value systems and how committed they are to total human equality, that all persons should be judged as individuals based on who he or she is, regardless of race, background, biology, or so forth, or sexual orientation. And I've advocated that ever since those days until now. But like I said, so I've been the kind of hidden figure inside the government, is what I told Thurgood back when I was interviewed by him back in 1955 to be his civil rights. I've been the promoter of civil rights to wide, solid, effective action inside of government's legal practices from 1958 to the day, his date. A person should not be judged by the accident of his parentage and the color of his skin, or his even religious affiliation or sex orientation, but based on his quality or her quality as a human being. That's my philosophy now. Matter of fact, 5 days from now, on March 15th, I will turn 88 years of age. I can't believe it, because when I was growing up as a black youngster, a Negro was segregated in Spotsylvania County, Virginia. In Virginia, most Negroes I knew died between 60 and 65 years of age. My father, he was only 62. My mother, she had Alzheimer's. I think even with Alzheimer's, she was in her 60s when she passed. That was the sociological existence of Negroes in segregated America. Very few lived beyond 60 and 65 years of age. And I think it's a miracle that good Lord has kept me alive to reach almost 88 years of age and still be as intellectually fired up as I was as a youngster growing up. But for the health hazard, I would like be on the road 2, 3, 4 times a month, electrifying, you might say, youngsters all over the country to develop this idealism I have, to show and prove that every human being should be judged based on his or her own merit, qualities, and abilities. And there should not be these artificial distinctions based on complexion, color, biological background, historical history, but judged as an individual with total equality. Like I said, I'm a staunch proposer of Martin Luther King's concept about character, but I think it's bigger than even character. It is intellectual capacity, it is personality, it's a question of open-mindedness and being open-minded like you appear to be. One request.
Yes.
That to the extent you make disclosures to other youth of this recording and of this Zoom meeting, I welcome it, because I want to reach as many people as I can with this philosophy, this dream, this idealism of Lord's Prayer. Let it be done here on earth as it is in heaven.
I definitely agree. And we can post it on our website, on our social media, and I know Global Youth Justice will as well.
Well, you have my total commission of it. Like I say, at this point, if I had my financial means and could protect my health, I would like to be talking to audiences. I'll tell you, I've gone in the schools here in DC and elsewhere around the country where I've given a talk for one class for 1 hour, and they cancel classes for the whole day and have me speak to every class in the school. And I come for a 1 hour session and I'm there all day. And I talk to them like I've talked to you. And I've talked to kids and so forth. And they gather around me like I'm Santa Claus. But like I said, I'm not in this for adoration or for publicity. I'm in it for doing good and make the most that life can accomplish, like I think Martin Luther King was. Unfortunately, he was assassinated too early in life, but I've been fortunate to almost now reach 88 years of age, and I'm going to continue doing so as long as good Lord gives me physical strength and good enough health to do it.